Now we have Mr. Ashish Chandorkar talking on social impact. Ashish Chandorkar is a management consultant and a business leader. His experience lies in setting up new consulting businesses and scaling them. He has consulted with several leading Fortune 500 firms and with large Indian corporations. Ashish also writes on public policy and politics in national media. His focus is energy, infrastructure, healthcare, and agriculture. His articles and views are published in newspapers like the Financial Express, the Hindu, Business Line, and the Mint. He is also a regular contributor to online media platforms like Swarajya, My Nation, The Pulse. Ashish is based in Pune. Over to you, Mr. Ashish.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashish Chandorkar. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you WMG for inviting me. Let me start off by saying that in the 108 versus 131 debate, I mean by pedigree I stand on the right side, on the 131 side. I did my MBA, but the list of that 108 people actually is a who's who of people who taught me during my MBA. Pretty much all of my B school profs who were the economics faculty actually signed that letter. So it's an interesting debate. I have been in the industry for the last 20 odd years, and I certainly favor the more skin in the game argument. And today I'm going to take you through about a set of reforms which are very fundamental to how this country lives and how this country will progress in the coming years, how human development indices will work, will develop, and so on. When we talk about reform, we essentially talk about factor reforms. I mean, people in our kind of a milieu, we always think about factor reforms. We talk about privatization and land reforms, the macroeconomic stuff. What we don't talk about is that there are several people living in the country who do not even have access to very basic amenities, stuff which we take for granted, which we have taken for granted from the day one since we were born, right? Or most of us would actually have had access to those amenities which even today elude a whole bunch of people in India. So my talk is not about macroeconomy or the fact that the debate between what is being done versus what could have happened. I like to talk about what has happened, and that to me is very critical, because when people vote or when people decide which political dispensation they like, they usually look at a delta change in their life. People who already have everything, you look at, it's like a Maslow's law of hierarchy of needs, right? So when you have everything basic, you then think about esoteric stuff like, is the data right or wrong? But for someone who did not have something as basic as, let's say, a toilet, for that person, whether the data has got an error of 3% or 30% is a less important point than the fact that that person has got a toilet today, right? So my talk focuses on something which is much more tangible, much more feel and touch type of stuff. I call it the ism-free reforms, because in economic theory we always debate capitalism versus socialism, right versus left. I'll take you through some examples of reforms which I think do not belong into any category. They just happened. So let me take a step back. Before this government came in 2014, there used to be a constant debate in India about India versus Bharat. I have taken a screenshot of some media personalities who would constantly, use this theme in their TV talks over the last 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, the snapshots are from 2009 till 2013. People would talk about, are there two countries? Is India different from Bharat? And the constant hypothesis which was built in our discourse was that yes, there were two Indias, there were two different countries. India was supposed to be more aspirational, modern, Western. There was no corruption in India, everything was hunky-dory, life was all nice, it was all glamorous. Bharat was all, backwards, and by backwards I mean wouldn't conform to the lifestyle of the urban India. It was supposed to be humble but corrupt, and those people had a bad influence on social indices. TV studios would constantly tell us that there is a tyranny of distance. This phrase was routinely used when someone would ask that, hey, why does media not report on something happening in Northeast India? The anchor would say, well, it's very difficult to reach to Northeast India, so we don't report from there. Essentially what they meant was that anything which was outside a 50-kilometer radius out of Delhi actually fell into a tyranny of distance case. What we heard and saw and the narrative which was built for years together of Indian live TV, which is like an era of 1993 to 2008-9 until Twitter happened and people started asking questions. Those 15, 16 years were essentially focused entirely on Delhi and the narrative which people in Delhi wanted us to know and hear, right? Our views did not matter, what was happening in the country did not matter, and it was essentially discarded the very broad brush of India versus Bharat argument. But you know, if you take a step back, where were we in 2014, right? So I have taken a few basic amenities. How did India fare on access to those amenities? So look at toilets. Only 38% of India had access to a toilet, right? I'm not talking about use of the toilet. We're talking about access to a toilet. Tap water, drinking water. Only about 39% households in India had access to running tap water in their houses. Power connections, electricity. About 80% of the country had access to power. And cooking gas. We had LPG in about 56% of the households. Now, while those stats look, I mean, you may say that 80% is a good number. The thing in India is a 20% exclusion essentially means 250 million people. That's like 4 Germanys, right? Oh, sorry, 4 Frances, right? So anything which is excluded, I mean, when a significant section of population is excluded from any kind of government service, the number of people who get excluded are phenomenally large. That's just the base effect of India's population. Yes, so we did reach these figures, 38%, 80%, 56% in the last, whatever, 70 odd years. But we reached there in a meandering way. There was no strategy behind reaching 80%. It just happened, right? And which is why we never completed the task, because no one really was thinking of completing the task. The focus was fine. There's a departmental allocation. There are budgets allocated every year. Let them be used. Are they effective? Are they being put to best use? Can something else be done? Those questions were never asked from a planning standpoint. Karan kind of touched upon that topic on the planning commission side, where because it was so Delhi centric, they were looking at data as something in complete isolation and in a very rarefied atmosphere, saying, okay, fine, let's move from X to Y. But they did not understand, where that investment was needed, why that investment was needed, and at what pace should it grow or change, right? So we did not measure anything. We just ended up here in 2014. So while most of us, of course, would have had access to these amenities forever, the fact is several people in India had not even heard about these amenities. In fact, I can go one step further and say things like railways. There are still several districts in India which have never seen a train engine or a train set, right? Because they don't have a railway station, even today. So the connectivity which we had, let's say what British left us with in 1947, we did not improve significantly much over it in the last 70 years, right? So the staggering number to me is like the access to toilets. About 800 or 775 million people in India did not have access to toilets, any toilets, unless they use the public ones. That's a staggering number of people when you would think that sanitation is almost like the most important aspect of a personal individual life. So, and even in the urban space, it's not just that a lot of people dismiss it as this as a rural problem, right? But let's look at some of the urban stories. So I've taken a snapshot of stories not so long ago. So the first picture is from Bhopal in 2012. People would queue up. There was a scam in Bhopal where people would just queue up for gas cylinders, and there would be long queues, but the cylinders wouldn't be given to them because the dealers were doing some hanky-panky behind the allocations, right? So yes, there was access, but there were actually no gas cylinders in many cases. The second example is again from 2012. India had a blackout. Do we remember this? India had a huge blackout in 2012. It went on for 2 days in late July of 2012. For the northern grid was completely shut down. The western grid also took the brunt of it. And almost 600 million people in India did not have power for 2 days. This is not very old. This is just 7 years old. The funny thing is that the then power minister had to then create a performance report of his own, and he rated his work excellent soon after that power outage, and he was promoted to home minister like a few months later. So, and then the third picture is from the Kumbh, where the Prime Minister of Mauritius, who visited in 2013 for the full Kumbh, he did not take a bath in the river Ganga because it was too dirty for him to take a bath. He did it this time, 6 years later, in the current Kumbh. So, just 6-7 years ago, we had fairly divergent and fairly exclusionary examples of how even urban India did not have access to what we think should be very common, right? I mean, you know, when you go to a different country, especially in the West, or countries which have got much better per capita income than ours, when you take sanitation for granted, you take a clean road for granted, you take access of power for granted. 6-7 years ago, even in urban India, this was not the base case. So in India, when you have access to something, that doesn't mean it's available. You just have access. It may or may not actually be provided to you. If it's available, the quality may be in question. So, quality is like the third order derivative of this phenomena, right? So we are still talking about access here, but the fact is even that wasn't there. And then in urban India, maybe we had moved towards right, but the quality was missing for most services. So then what changed when the Modi government came in, right? So let's look at some of the key aspects of governance which took a different turn starting 2014. So the first point was the scale of ambition. So for every scheme which Modi government launches, the target is always 100%, right? I mean, the first target is always 100% to do something by year X, year Y, year Z. Karan kind of hinted that some of these things have been mocked in the past, that, what's the big deal? How can launching a program achieve, make 100% achievement of a target? I think it's a fair question. Targets will obviously be missed. What people do not realize is that until you set a really ambitious target from the top, people don't act. A lot of stuff in India happens only in mission mode. It doesn't happen in a process mode. It's the same municipality, it's the same Gram Parishad, Zilla Parishad. They will act if you tell them that in the next 1 year you have to get this done. If you tell them that this is the process, this is the budget allocation, do it, things may never end, right? So one of the key differences has been that the scale of ambition has been very high. Everything has to be 100% completed, and there's an end date for that. The end dates will be missed in most cases. That's a given, right? But that's not the point. The point is that the delta then what it achieves is humongous. Also, there are political costs of doing such stuff. Karan talked about demonetization. There are other things as well. For example, the most recent, I can take a very recent example. So in Varanasi right now, there's a temple circuit which is being constructed. The PM just inaugurated it before the model code got launched like 2 or 3 weeks ago. He inaugurated a project which actually involves demolishing houses. Now Varanasi is its own constituency. The government has purchased about 300-400 houses around the Kashi Vishwanath temple. They're going to demolish the houses, pay the compensation, etc., but then create a common public space around the Kashi Vishwanath temple. So there are political costs of doing such stuff, and the PM has kind of managed that in his stride. There's also the stock versus flow argument. I think a lot of folks, you may have noticed this, that the approach of this government has been to focus on flow and not so much on the stock. It's not so much been to correct what was bad in the economy or in social life or in politics, but they've taken a view that, okay, fine, what exists, but let's take a new approach and make a fresh start, right? This is true of several cases. I'll talk about some of that later in the presentation. So it's more about creating a parallel structure which works rather than trying to correct the ills of what exists over the last few decades. There's also the behavioral change about public participation, about asking people to give suggestions, using apps to put your point across. At scale like ours, some of it works, some of it doesn't work. Clearly, not every suggestion is going to go to the government. Even if it goes to the government, it may not be acted upon. But personally, I have a personal example. So when GST got launched, and I come from a technology background, IT background, so I could see some of the challenges which were building up in the run-up to the GST. I mean, apart from the fact that the software wasn't very well tested when it went live, there were fundamental issues around change management, right? Because it was not just about the technology change, it was also about how the processes were changing. Like you know this better than me, but surely all of you spent several sleepless nights in June, July 2017, right? And that happened, I think that aspect was probably not very well managed. So I had written a fairly scathing article in one of the publications about the 10 things which GST implementation has got wrong. Now that article thankfully for some reason must have got escalated in Delhi somewhere, and several people actually called me, and when I won't name anyone, but like significant people who work at high levels, higher echelons of this government, they actually personally called me to take the feedback. Now the irony is that I had actually written the article more on my understanding of GST. I mean, I don't have to deal with the systems, or I wasn't really running a company or anything like that. So I had to then seek secondary feedback and give them practical examples about what was going wrong. But I think it was a great gesture that someone at a cabinet minister rank or a state minister rank would call me to ask, why did I write what I wrote? So there's a certain amount of feedback mechanism which this government has built in. I wouldn't say it's 100% institutional. It cannot be 100% institutional unless you go towards a complete referendum-based system, which we are not. But I think the ideas do bubble up once in a while, which is I think a good thing, and they have certainly helped the government in fixing some of the larger agenda items which they have taken up, and also measure everything. There's been this constant debate about, I mean, see, at one level you can say that we are arguing that whether the GDP is 7.5% or 6.5%. But isn't it great that we are talking about 6.5 and 7.5 and not 3.5? I mean, you can argue that maybe the government could do 8% or 8.5%. But the fact is that because the data has become so important in our day-to-day lives. I mean, how many of us 5 years ago were tracking quarterly GDP? Unless you were in that profession where you were part of some kind of financial modeling, or if you were doing company strategies, that is fine. But how many people actually knew what the quarterly GDPs were on a real-time basis? Today, the arguments both in pro and against them starts like the moment. I mean, people actually know that the GDP comes out at the last day of the second month of the previous quarter, right? So you people are sitting there at 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m. on Feb 28th to figure out what's going to be the GDP print of December, the OND quarter. So I think that the fact that the data awareness has significantly increased in the system, I think it's a huge positive. We can debate about the data itself, the correctness of it or the accuracy of it, but the fact that so many of us are actually talking data, which is important to the country, itself is a huge advantage, because when you measure what you are talking about, the chances that someone can take you for a ride obviously becomes lesser in a longer term. So, and the good thing is that some of these changes have happened with the same government machinery, with the same apparatus, which we all criticize all the time, saying government doesn't do anything, it is inefficient, there's lethargy, bureaucracies is not designed to do any achievable result. And the fact is, what I'll talk about in the next 4 slides has been achieved with the same lethargic quote-unquote bureaucracy, which we have always complained about. So the fact is, the systems can work. It's a question of how do you drive them towards a greater performance. So let me talk about 3 specific success stories here, right? So the first one is on the LPG access in India. Ujjwala program was a key input to that process. The government targeted giving away 8 crore domestic LPG connections in the next, this program started in 2015-16, so the target was that by 2022 there will be 8 crore connections. The target kept varying. It was first 4 crores, became 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it's 8 till 2022, but the 7 crore connections have already been achieved as of this year. It will be on back burner for the next 2-3 months because the model code of conduct, but we should hit the 8 crore target fairly rapidly by the end of this year itself. States have made their own variations, like in some cases states have gone ahead and given free gas stoves, or they've done their own small changes to make the program more attractive to their own audience depending on their own context. The refills have to be paid for. I'll talk about this issue a little later. So what you get in Ujjwala program, or what a household gets, is essentially a gas connection. In some states the equipment is also sponsored. And if you buy or refill your gas stoves, the gas cylinders, you pay for it on the market price. Then, of course, there's a Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which is, and I'm limiting this point only to the construction of toilets. The program itself has got a huge ambit, but I will talk only about access to the sanitation part here. So, between 8 to 10 crore toilets have been constructed in India in the last 4.5 years. The program started in October 2014, so it's about, let's say, 4.5 years since it was launched. Depending on what estimates you take and which central or state data you subscribe to, the number could fall in that range. But let's say about 9.5, 9.6 crores is a number which is most often quoted by different sources. The government also did a great job of bringing in CSR participation. Since CSR had anyway become mandatory and there was a 2% profit to be flowed into some of these activities, I think it was a great idea to have that money, part of that money being diverted towards this cause for capex and for funding. The government aims to create a open defecation-free India. We have made some progress on that. I'll talk about that as well. There are different rural and urban program designs, which is it takes into account several social factors, the sanitation, the acceptability in rural India, what the social norms are, etc. So the program design does account for pretty much all of that. The third part is village electrification. In 2014, India had about 18,452 villages unelectrified. India has about 6 lakh villages, a little more than 6 lakh revenue villages. In India, there's a concept of a revenue village or a revenue town. What it means is when you do a census in 2001, 11, 21, the census classifies a certain geography or a certain area as a revenue village, which essentially means that there are land records available and then there's certain taxation implication of that locality for the government, for the local government or for the state government. So that is called a revenue village. Now, India had almost 18,452 villages still is unelectrified. So a lot of people ask the question, what's the big deal? I mean, the fact is you've got 6 lakh villages. What it means is, 5,80,000 villages were electrified. Yes, of course they were, but as we know, it's a classic 80-20 thing or 90-10 thing. You can take a project to 90% completion. It's almost always the last 10% which eludes or escapes, the sense of control. And that's what the government achieved by electrifying those villages. They took it a level further by saying that it's not just villages, we will also electrify all willing households in India. So anyone who was willing to take a power connection, and by willing, that word is very important because then whoever takes the power connection has to pay for the use of power. So anyone who was willing to take a power connection would get a power connection. As per an estimate, about 3.9 crore households did not have power connection, which after audit became 2.6 crores. And pretty much all of them have been electrified except for 19,000 villages in Chhattisgarh. And they have not been electrified largely because of the Naxal situation there. And with the change of government, that process has also significantly slowed down since December of last year. But barring that, pretty much everything else is done. The next target is a 24/7 power availability for all households. So also, I think I'll take you through about details of the 3 programs, but what we need to really keep in mind is a lot of it is just a start, it's not an end. Yes, I mean the government is tracking it towards a full completion, there's metrics being published, there's fairly transparent data about what happens in which village, etc. The fact is that to stabilize a design towards a steady state situation, it might still take a few more years, but the good thing is that we have made a fairly brisk progress on all those 3. So let me take the first one, which is use of gas, right? Use of LPG. So we have covered all 700 districts, 8 to 10 crores. Sorry, I got the caption wrong, but about 8 crore connections have been given for the LPG. You can apply online. Anyone who, I think this is an issue which even the urban people face, right? There was always a lack of delivery of gas cylinders at home, or complaints wouldn't be resolved. I think some of that has improved significantly. You don't see as much complaints coming up for these state agencies. And all the 3 big players in that market, in the retail petroleum products market, which is Indian Oil, HPCL and BPCL, have been participating in that program. What has enabled this revolution is that government actually allowed selling 5 kg refills over the counter. Earlier, when you ordered a gas cylinder, it actually meant a 16 kg or a 14 kg gas cylinder, depending on which vendor you were tied up to. And that was the only way of ordering. There were dealer networks to whom you ordered. With the launch of Ujjwala, government has also now allowed several outlets to sell smaller cylinders, smaller SKUs. I mean, the fact that smaller SKUs work in India is a fairly well-known thing. Anyone who's read about business success stories of FMCG companies, I mean, these things are taught in B schools, and case study after case study, how just the SKU management can significantly lead to a market entrenchment for a consumer products company in India, right? I mean, it's true of mobile data recharges where numbers have fallen from 1,099 to 99 rupees. It's true of FMCG companies, it's true of bank accounts with minimum balances, but it was never applied to a government program design. So this was a very important step towards making the program successful, which is to say that the gas cylinders could be much smaller in nature and they could be freely available across over the counter without any licensing requirements of selling it. So what have been the first order effects? The way I want to look at each of these three changes is that there's of course a direct impact of what's happening. There's a second order impact which will be known in a few years, and there could be a distant term impact which you may only realize it once some of that has actually showed up in data. So the first order impact is the more use of LPG across India. This year will be the highest ever LPG consumption of India, LPG consumption in India in a financial year. It also means that we are importing more LPG because LPG is not something which we get. And when I say LPG, it also includes, let's say, the natural gas, because I mean we kind of import both of them together. Less firewood use, which is environmentally friendly, and less respiratory diseases. I think some of the economists are finally getting into this design of surveys around how Ujjwala has impacted the respiratory diseases reduction in North India, which is where bulk of the initial program was focused in UP and Chhattisgarh and Bengal. I think that data should start coming out now in the next year or so, but I think this will be a significant achievement of this program, which is to have women cooking on using firewood. They don't have to inhale any smoke going forward. The second order effect. So now this frees up a lot of time for women to work. A lot of time for rural women in India was actually spent on collecting firewood. They would go out in the morning after doing their daily chores, collect firewood, get it back, store it, maintain it, ensure that rain doesn't spoil it and stuff like that. So it opens up a greater time window for women to participate in labor force. It also creates a piped natural gas infrastructure. Now that everyone has got, several retail consumers have got LPG in their houses, the government is now pushing a project called Urja Ganga, which is around creating a piped natural gas setup in retail houses, I mean for retail consumers in your houses. So this program is largely, I mean of course several cities already have PNG. I live in Pune, Mumbai have had PNG for like years together. So most cities in Gujarat have PNG as well. Bangalore also has a GAIL pipeline, so I'm assuming that several societies in Bangalore also offer a PNG option. But Eastern India, which is generally untouched by a lot of modernization or development or infrastructure investment, that's been lagging here. And it's kind of an irony because all the gas, I mean, whatever deposits we have are actually on that side, on the eastern side. So that will improve over time. If you have been following the city gas distribution auctions, you will know it's the new hot area of investment. Pretty much all the companies who are in the gas distribution or gas handling space have bid and won several cities in city gas distribution auctions. So very soon you will have, like you have power supply using private players, you will now have gas distribution via these private firms coming up in the next 2 to 3 years. Longer term, if India becomes a largely gas-based economy, we can then decide on our import contracts accordingly, right? I mean, if today the problem is that you have to import everything, like all, I mean, we import crude, we refine it in India, some of it is exported, some of it is consumed back, but it's a bit of a hodgepodge because you are importing and exporting several different, byproducts in that cycle. If it's a largely gas-based economy, you know who are the vendors, which countries are really strong in that space, and you can cut a forward deal for the next few years at prices which are better. And when you have a much stable petroleum management system in India, it also impacts the geopolitics, because then you know which countries to deal with, which countries you can oppose in international fora and so on. It also gives you better leverage for Northeast India. Northeast India has got gas deposits, so some of that people will see the trickle down effect of this change happening. Catch up for Eastern India, and also new job creation. So when you lay down new pipelines, or you have city gas distribution structures, obviously they have to be laid down, they have to be constructed, maintained, there has to be customer billing, customer service, all of that. So this opens up a huge new opportunity for jobs like the telecom revolution did, or the banking or the insurance revolution did in the last 2 decades. Next is the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. So in India, cleanliness has always been someone else's responsibility. The way most people live in their houses is houses are clean, but they don't care what's happening outside. people might throw something outside because it's municipal corporation's job to really clean up the streets, right? I think what Swachh Bharat Abhiyan has changed is it has changed the mindset to some extent. Government has currently declared about 616 districts, 30 states and UTs open defecation free. Now, the definition of ODF is essentially that people have got access to sanitation. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is still actually using it. People might still be using, may still be defecating in the open, but the fact is that the percentages come down. Even the studies which are most critical of government on the Swachh Bharat program acknowledge that in states like Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, UP, Chhattisgarh, where ODF was in excess of 70–80% before this was launched, the studies scored that has come down to 40%. So even if you think that people are not using toilets, even if you subscribe to that line of thought or line of research, the fact is that the ODF reduction is still a reality. And that it has come down from, it has moved from 80% to 40% is a significant achievement that has happened only in, 4.5 years. The government has actually spent about 0.5% of its budget just on toilet creation in the last, in the last 4.5 years. There's also been some extremely important enablers, right? So for example, comparative surveys between states and cities and municipalities. So that gives the local bodies a reason to really act on some of these things which they should have acted upon any which way, but they did not over the years. So that gamification of how the success is measured, I think it's a very interesting aspect of how this program, I mean, I believe that it's a key ingredient of the success of this program. Open to CSR spending, which has helped get more money into it. Also, there's been, I mean, these programs used to exist earlier, right? There used to be Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan. There was also total sanitation coverage launched by different ministries and different governments in the past. But none of these programs had the speed and the agility, speed and the scale what this government has demonstrated. So that is a key differentiator. So the first order effect is, of course, the country is cleaner. Now, again, a lot of people in big cities say, I have not seen any difference. What has changed? You should actually visit some of the cities in North India. I actually grew up in Indore and MP, so Indore is now the cleanest city in the country. And people who are cynical about it should actually go and visit the city to see what really has changed. But for someone who actually grew up in North India, can completely relate to this. Like, we used to play out in the open where pigs would roam about. They would, your cricket ball would fall into a sewer which was not cleaned. You picked up the ball and continued to play. I mean, that is how life was for us, and it's just 25 years ago. So from that point on, the fact that cities after cities have laid down, full sanitation networks, there's plans to clean sewage, recycling of water, trenching has improved in several cities. So you have to go to some of these cities to really understand the impact if you are cynical about it. I mean, you will come with your eyes wide open. Some of my friends who are from social media were actually very cynical that they all live in Mumbai or some in Bangalore, some in Delhi. They said, well, nothing changes, it's all the same. So I actually took them to Indore in December of last year for a 3-day tour a guided tour of the city and some of the nearby areas. And they were actually left flummoxed. They see none of them in the metro cities, and it's a reality that the municipal corporation of the large cities probably are not as efficient as they should be. But they were really impressed by what they saw in those smaller cities. And the fact that people are very proud about it. There was this constant talk about, common people talking about Sarvekshan hone wala hai, we need to do well in this survey. I don't want to do something because that might cut marks of my city, stuff like that. So that gamification actually has really helped a lot. Second order effects. So India has seen a huge increase of tourists, foreign tourist arrival. 2018 was the first time when India got more than 1 crore tourists. That's an abysmal figure because even an island of Thailand or a Disney park, a theme park in Hong Kong or Paris might be getting significantly more number of tourists than what all of India gets in a single year. Now, given our diversity, given our rich culture, heritage, the fact that we are so well integrated in the global economy via our large cities, it's actually a shame that not more people come to India to visit this country, right? I mean, because that also can kickstart a virtuous cycle of new hotels, new transportation options, and so on. So there's a whole derivative economy of tourism, which India has never leveraged. For the first time, so December 2017 was the first month where we got more than 10 lakh people in a single month. And 2018 was the first year when we got more than 1 crore people in a single month coming to India, purely from a tourism standpoint on tourist visas. So as the country becomes cleaner and some of these stories percolate, tourism will have a major bump. We are also investing in infrastructure about, about recycling, drainage creation, sewage treatment, stuff like that. So that gives a big impetus for the MSMEs, because bulk of the companies which operate in that space are small companies. They are Indian companies which will produce equipment to install those and to run them. A lot of those solutions are institutional. So what we hear about stories about the Ganga cleaning, for example, what has changed now is that what's making the difference now is actually the investment, the capex investment around some of these cleanliness investments. It's not just about someone just going in a boat and cleaning Ganga. It's about actually stopping the source of pollutants, which needs a fair amount of capex in various ways. So that institutional change is coming up, which is a good thing because that can be replicated. I mean, Ganga is just one aspect of it, but then every big river in India faces the same problem. So that same investment can be replicated across at least the 10-15 big rivers of the country. Integration with all large gatherings. So you talk about Kumbh. I think a lot of people, you must have read stories about Kumbh being super successful, very clean, very well managed. I can say at a smaller scale in Maharashtra, for example, where I live in Pune, close to Pune, we have these yatras which go to temples like Pandharpur. The feedback is uniform. People see a change between 3-4 years ago and today. If you walk that stretch today, you will find much more cleanliness, much more well integrated, sewage management and stuff like that. Third order, of course, it creates capacity in the economy for the local bodies, because local bodies for the first time understand that they actually have a job to do, and they just cannot keep winning or contesting elections without performing on some of these matrices. So for the first time, people are talking about these things in their election pitches, which means that they become much more responsible when they win or lose elections. There have been public movements in several places. One classic example is of a gentleman called Afroz Shah. Not sure if you have heard of him, but Afroz Shah is a gentleman in Mumbai who single-handedly cleaned the Versova beach. It was one of the dirtiest beaches in the world about 4 years ago. Today, it's one of the cleanest beaches in India. If you visit Mumbai, I mean, most people who visit Mumbai do not go to any of the beaches because you think, that's going to be super crowded and super unclean. But Versova beach is a complete antithesis. You should visit that beach. It's completely changed. Especially if you've actually been there in the past, and if you go now, you will see a sea change in terms of what has happened there. He has now taken up the task of cleaning the Meethi River in Mumbai, which is of course a much more significant effort investment. But the fact that there are public movements being created in society out of citizen participation is a significant achievement of this program, I would say. And this can only increase in the years to come. The third part is about the village electrification. So I actually took a snapshot thinking we will have some visibility of the slides, but since it's not there, what I have here on the left top is a friend of mine, Nikhil, who lives in Bangalore. He became a big guy on Twitter. A lot of people followed him on Twitter in the years 2011, 12, 13, because he would constantly complain about Bescom. Every day he would just bash Bescom, saying there's no power, there's a power cut, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. A lot of people used to follow him just to know what's the electricity situation in Bangalore of that day. So I actually marked a few tweets of his from 2011, 12, 13. I don't see much of Bescom bashing these days on social media. I mean, I'm sure there's a power scarcity here and there, but the way we used to live just about 6, 7, 8 years ago, things have significantly changed because of the way the power architecture has changed in the country. So it started off with the 18,000 villages which were electrified. I mentioned about that. We then electrified almost all households in India except about 19,000 which are in the left-wing extremism impacted districts, but hopefully it should happen soon. And a reasonable assurance of getting power. So what people used to complain about their power boards every day on Twitter or Facebook. A lot of that has gone down because there's a reasonable assurance that you will get power. Of course, there are some glitches here and there, but things have by and large changed for the better. So how did they change, right? So the first was that I think in this government for the first time, the power ministry was seen as something aspirational. If I ask you who was the power minister in 2013, because I just told you it was Sushil Shinde, you may still remember it, but if I ask you who was the guy before Sushil Shinde, you may not know it. I mean, no one would know it, right? Because power ministry was just one of those things which was there. You just managed a few central PSUs, largely focusing on generation with NTPC and some of the other sources of generation outside of thermal. But there was hardly any integration with the national power usage patterns in the country, right? So that is a significant change. The power ministry elevated its stature significantly when Mr. Piyush Goyal took over in 2014. He laid a lot of focus on data. Yeah, I can just. Thanks. So one change which he brought about was to have a lot of focus on data. There were apps like Garv, which was tracking of Gramin Vidyutikaran. So how do you track which villages has got electrified? All of that was available via apps for you to see. And these apps went into excruciating details. Like for example, the Garv app had a 12-layer definition of what electrification was. So right from government approving a proposal to buying of electricity poles and equipments and transformers to that equipment reaching the village, you could track all of that on the app. So there's constant nitpicking that there's a budget but nothing is happening. Even if nothing was happening, you could track it on the app and you can complain about it. So that data, the culture of data tracking became very critical in this ministry. Also, the tracking was happening at a last meter level, not last mile, but it was happening at the level of, this is the place where the pole needs to be erected in the village. Here is a picture which was uploaded 3 days ago. Has it happened or not, right? So the tracking was at that level. And the center actually forced states to act, which was a very important aspect. Power is a dual subject. It's in the concurrent list, right? So the central government does some stuff. The distribution is completely with the states, by and large. So the center actually forced the states to act to make some of this happen, which was a great example of how the federal systems should work. So the first order effect is that everyone in India has power already. This has also helped people launch or companies launch better consumer technologies. I mean, we talked about LED bulbs, but more DC-based systems have come into play at a certain scale, which has helped the smaller companies make investments in that area. We are talking about great execution capabilities being built upon 2 of those PSUs. So REC, which is Rural Electrification Corporation, and EESL, which is Energy Efficient Services of India Limited. They've built super execution capabilities in terms of how to run large programs at a scale in a time-bound manner. Countries like Malaysia, UK, a lot of them have been asking about our expertise of how you can run programs in the electricity domain or a power domain for their countries with the help of our PSUs. So that's another interesting first-order effect of this effort. The second-order impact is that power availability has already catalyzed mobile penetration in India. In several villages about 4-5 years ago, you had to walk like a kilometer to charge your mobile, which meant that you could only buy mobiles which had longer battery life, which means they were not smartphones. And B, some people just did not buy mobiles because it was just inconvenient. Now the mobile penetration rate, one of the things which people do not correlate why the mobile penetration rate in India has shot up in the last, say, 5-6 years, is because the power situation has improved significantly. People have connections, and whatever new connections are given in the house, the government actually has defined giving a power point source for mobile charging as one of the necessary list of it's part of the checklist basically. So you get like a fan, a bulb, and a connection for charging your mobiles. So that's a very significant change which has happened. More power demand will of course help stabilize the sector. I think the utilization rates on the generation side are still fairly low. We are still the private sector is still kind of reeling with some of the impacts of the last decade's bad investments, but things are changing. At least the NTPC based systems have been stable at about 72% PLFs. The private sector has moved from about 50 to 55, 60 in the last 3-4 years. Also, third order effect is that this puts a lot of spotlight on clean and green energy. Several states led by Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, MP, Rajasthan, they've made significant investments in renewable power sources. India actually added about 100 gigawatts of generation capacity in the last 5 years. We were at 240 gigawatts of capacity in 2014, we are at 340 gigawatts now. Yes, there's certainly an issue of capacity utilization in India, there's no doubt about that. The thermal plants are in bad shape. The private investments have not really yielded the results the way it was projected in 2007-8 when they set up those plants. But the fact is that there's also been a shift towards a different, experimenting with different power sources in the last few years. One interesting part is that there's been a great improvement in transmission capabilities. India actually has got 5 different grids in different parts of the country. Actually 6 different grids because Northeast has got a separate grid. till 2014-15, these grids were not connected in the full way. There were some connections to pump power from north to south, and the way Indian power sector is organized is a lot of generation happens in north and in west. That's where the coal reserves are, and that's where the hydro power gets generated. But the consumption happens in west and south because that's where the industrial centers are, right? So Mumbai, Pune, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai. And there was no power transmission capability. So one reason why Bescom got bashed up on Twitter every day was, they did not have power to buy from. I mean, their equipments were just old, and there was no way to pump power from north to south. The reason they don't get bashed anymore is because India has invested significantly more in transmission. So the number of circuit kilometers we've added in the last 4 years has been more than the circuit kilometers ever established in India in the last 70 years. And that is the reason why South India sees much lesser power problem today, because a lot of the north and the eastern and the central power can now get pumped into cities like Bangalore much more easily. So while we talk about the good things, there are also some questions to be asked about some of these programs and some of the things which need to be addressed, right? So on LPG, the biggest issue potentially is the question of refill. Now, yes, you can give a connection to someone, but will that person refill the gas cylinder? This is a question asked by different people. Again, it's a question of data. There are different estimates that between 55 and 80% is the only refill rate. Other people don't refill it. Possible, again, that data will evolve in the times to come. How do you also manage the government LPG subsidy, right? Because now there are so many people, how do you actually put subsidy back in an ever increasing number of LPG connections? So there's also a proposal that should you merge a kerosene, PNG and LPG subsidy into one, saying this is a cooking subsidy, right, of some sort. Because India today spends about 4,500 crores each year in kerosene subsidy even today. Because that kerosene doesn't seem to be going away out of the Indian mindset, and especially in the rural usage. So one question is to think about is that should all the subsidies be merged together, so that if the LPG then becomes much cheaper, would people shift from kerosene to gas in villages? That is one question to be answered in the next years. On Swachh Bharat, we already discussed that the status of open defecation free means that people have access to toilets. Are they actually using it? Is there running water? What is the role of, the central government can actually fund construction of toilets, but then what should the Gram Parishads do, the Zilla Parishads do? Because that's where, the maintenance needs to happen, right? That's where the cleaning needs to happen. That's where the sewer lines need to be put in. That's where the water pipeline needs to be put in, right? So these questions are good questions and important questions which will keep government on its toes to ensure that those promises are completely fulfilled. Also, how do you take best practices of, I spoke about Indore, but some of those cities who have done really good on some of these aspects. What are other cities doing to learn from them? The answer today is nothing. Like, there's absolutely no cross-pollination of ideas. Similarly, on the power side, we have power for almost, as we said, but we do see power cuts even today routinely, right? So how do you make it 24/7 power? That's the next step. So the next 3-4 years will be spent on making that happen. One of the prime areas of investment there is to separate the feeders which feed power to agriculture, for agriculture purpose and for household or for industrial purposes. So that feeder separation is only about 60% complete in India today. Good news is that it is 60% complete because it was not there earlier at all. It was at 14-15% levels 4 years ago. Today it is 60%. So that needs to increase to about 100%. To then you can then create vertically integrated power chains, right? So you can have more solar pumps for agriculture use. You can have more standalone networks for agriculture or village utilization, while the more thermal plus the spike power will for the urban consumption can be via the normal grid which we have laid in India. So those questions need to be addressed, and of course there's also the question of the distribution companies or the DISCOMs getting their acts together and becoming more efficient and less leaky in how they operate their businesses. So then you can say that the glass is half full, you can say the glass is half empty, but the fact is a lot of people who have benefited did not have a glass 5 years ago, and there was no water in it at all. Since there was no glass, there was no water also. So people like us, we debate, this data is right, this data is wrong. But the fact is that data is only there because something has happened. And you can infinitely debate because none of this concerns us. We have access to all of this and more. But the fact is, close to at the minimum, about 250 million people did not have access to power. 775 million people did not have access to toilets. And about 480 million people did not cook using LPG, right? For them, our debates have no meaning. especially for the ones who have actually got the access to those amenities. Right? So this is not it. There are a few other things as well where government is trying to invest similar programs. So there's Ayushman Bharat for healthcare, where for the first time we have got a single payer system. A lot of our thinking in public life is influenced by the American systems, American designs. So for insurance, our base case has always been an insurance-led model. I mean, for healthcare, it's always been an insurance-led model, which is the American model, right? But we never look at, say, NHS in UK as a great example. It's a fairly, UK is not as big as US, but I mean, they still have a fairly large number of people in Europe, one of the largest countries, and they run a fairly successful single-payer type of a system, right? So Ayushman Bharat for the first time achieves that, I mean, or at least tries to achieve it. It will cover 50 crore people, beneficiaries under its ambit. Currently about 5 crore people are more or less enrolled in the system. It will take about 2 years to complete the full cycle. But after that, the healthcare facilities will be available for free based on government government approved hospitals to about 50 crore people across the country. Awas Yojana, so there's Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, urban and Grameen, right? There are two different home Awas Yojanas going on. So these programs allow people to have their own house, own homes, own pakka houses in wherever they are living in the same locality. So there are 4 different ways in which that is being administered. For a certain segment of people, they get an interest subvention on what they borrow. There's another class of people who can use affordable housing. So government is giving subsidies for affordable housing. The third option is to have a beneficiary-led construction, where if you are constructing your own house, then you get certain subsidies in your loans, etc. And the fourth is creating a slum rehabilitation structure with public-private participation. So those are the 4 ways in which government is constructing houses for all. The target for that is to construct about 1.25 crore houses by the end of 2022. And I think of all the programs that we spoke about, that one probably is going a little slow, although it might catch up in the years to come, just because the budgetary allocations were lesser in the first couple of years. It's taken a bit of a time to ramp up, but the 2022 target is still quite achievable for that program. And then also the financial inclusion, both on the credit side and also on the deposit side, with bank accounts via Jan Dhan and then Mudra, which is the credit-based facility for small entrepreneurs. So this is what, when the PM talks about ease of living in his speeches, this is really what he's talking about. These 6 areas, I would say, form the basis of the argument that the ease of living in India has improved. Has it improved for everyone? No. Has it improved for a significant number of people? The answer is a very emphatic yes. Now, how do you classify these reforms, right? I started by saying that in India, all our debates are around left and right, socialism and capitalism, right? Government control versus private participation. For a country of India's scale and complexity, I think there are no right answers. Even for these program designs, there are elements of both left and right in the program designs, right? So if you look at on the left side, there's much more government intervention. Government is directly doing some of these things. The design is led by government. There is extra money to be paid when we are paying an extra cess for Swachh Bharat, for example, right? This can be seen as doles, like government making a population dependent on itself for houses or for power or for several other amenities. Government is doing a freemium model where you get something for free, but then you have to pay for it for the use, right? So it's a capex versus opex thing. Is that the right thing to do? Question mark. Should government be actually nudging people to behave in a certain way? What is the cost of marketing? So those are the questions which people on the right-wing quote-unquote economists will debate about. If you look at the other side, the elements of the right-wing economics in these policies, which the left-wing economists will not like. So stuff like capacity creation in one factor market, which is labor. All these programs will eventually leave, of course, they all involve capex of their own, which creates jobs, but also frees up time for people to do other more significantly useful things. So the profile of the labor or the workforce will change once all of this is in place. So over the next 10, 15 years, people will have much more free time to take up more productive elements of economy compared to just sitting at home and cooking or cleaning their own toilets or walking 2 kilometers to actually use it, to use a toilet, right? So stuff like that is changing. Better HDI means you can then have your resource allocations tied down more better. So when the government prepares a budget, The money which is allocated to different ministries, that can be completely relooked at once the HDI numbers ramp up in the country. This also creates capacity in local government and local bodies, something which India has completely been devoid of in the last few decades, right? So bulk of our local bodies are very inefficient, or they just don't have the vision to run what they are running. They are there mainly for a political purpose. They are not there for an administrative purpose. So that changes with some of these things coming into play. So more capacity in the system. The government has introduced competitive federalism. States are competing against each other. Cities are competing against each other. Ministries are competing against each other. Sometimes they will cry foul that, I did not get the right score. Government did not, Niti Aayog dinged me on some XYZ parameter. Fine, those are good debates to have, right? The fact that you're actually measuring something and holding someone accountable is a good debate to have rather than doing nothing and not having any measurement at all. And of course, there's a supply side boost via government capex, right? So government spending currently is driving pretty much all of it, except maybe for the toilet creation where a lot of CSR is involved. But government has been the main spender on all of these programs as of now. So that's the story. I mean, I would then call it a pragmatism based or pragmatic reforms. This is neither left nor right. It just needs to happen, and some of it is happening. That is it from my side.